The world that delivered these men to Texas had been shaped by years of certainty. In Berlin and Tokyo, the war had been framed not merely as a contest of armies, but as a collision of systems. Axis leadership taught that the United States was rich in materials but poor in discipline, soft from comfort, divided by class and politics, incapable of sustained sacrifice. American factories, they claimed, were inefficient. American workers undisciplined. American soldiers poorly trained and dependent on excess rather than skill. It was a comforting narrative. It suggested that victory would belong to those hardened by scarcity and obedience. When Germany invaded Poland in September 1939, and when Japan expanded across East Asia shortly thereafter, the United States remained distant, watching from across oceans. That distance became central to Axis propaganda. America, they argued, did not understand modern war. It had not endured bombing, occupation, or rationing on its own soil. It would lose interest. Its people would not accept loss. Its economy, driven by consumption rather than command, would falter under pressure. This belief survived even after December 1941. Pearl Harbor brought the United States into the war, but Axis assessments remained confident. American mobilization was dismissed as theatrical. Speeches were loud, posters colorful, but the substance, Axis planners believed, would prove hollow. Germany focused on the Eastern Front. Japan pressed deeper into the Pacific. The United States was considered dangerous, but distant and ultimately fragile. Yet behind the scenes, a transformation was already underway. Between 1940 and 1943, the United States executed the largest industrial mobilization in human history. Automobile plants were converted into aircraft factories. Refrigerator manufacturers turned to machine guns. Shipyards rose where farmland had been. By 1944, American factories were producing nearly half of the world's military equipment. This was not improvisation. It was systematized abundance. At the center of this transformation was logistics. American planners understood that wars were not won by moments of heroism alone, but by supply, fuel, ammunition, food, spare parts, clothing. The United States Army Service Forces coordinated rail networks, ports, warehouses, and depots with an efficiency that dwarfed pre-war standards. A single infantry division required hundreds of tons of supplies per day. The American solution was not rationing at the front, but overproduction at the rear. For Axis soldiers, none of this was visible. What they experienced instead was scarcity. Germany faced chronic shortages by 1942. Fuel, rubber, food. Japan's maritime lifelines were increasingly strangled by submarines. Rations shrank. Equipment wore out. Replacement became uncertain. Hardship was reframed as virtue. Endurance became proof of superiority. Captivity, therefore, carried its own expectations. German soldiers knew of Soviet prison camps, where starvation and death were common. Japanese soldiers were taught that capture itself was dishonor, often equated with death. American captivity, in Axis imagination, was a threat, not merely to life, but to dignity, beatings, forced labor, revenge. These fears were reinforced by wartime rumor and selective reporting. What Axis soldiers did not fully grasp was that the United States approached captivity as an extension of its system, not an emotional response to the enemy. The Geneva Convention was not a slogan. It was policy. Feeding prisoners adequately was not charity. It was regulation. Labor programs were structured, paid, and supervised. Camps were supplied to the same logistical arteries that fed American troops. By 1943, more than 400,000 Axis prisoners of war would be transported to the United States. They would be housed in camps spread across nearly every state. Many would work on farms and lumber yards or near supply depots. And for the first time, they would see the American war effort not through propaganda or aerial bombardment, but from inside, quietly, daily, and without ceremony. That encounter, still distant at this stage, was approaching, and with it came a confrontation not of weapons, but of scale, one that would unsettle assumptions forged long before the first shot was fired. The journey itself was the first rupture. After capture in North Africa, Italy, or Western Europe, Axis soldiers were processed, cataloged, and moved not east toward revenge, But west, across an ocean they had been told was America's greatest weakness, the Atlantic, once portrayed as a protective moat, became a corridor of movement. Prisoners boarded ships under guard, not in chains, but in formations that mirrored military order. The crossing was long, uneventful, and meticulously organized. Meals arrived on schedule. Medical inspections were routine. Nothing about the passage suggested collapse or improvisation. Upon arrival, the scale widened further. Trains carried prisoners inland for days. Through slatted windows, they saw a country that appeared uninterrupted by war. Cities intact, farms operating at full rhythm, rail yards stacked with freight cars waiting their turn, not abandoned or bombed. The distances alone were disorienting. Germany could be crossed in hours. Here, days passed and the landscape continued without pause. By late 1944, the United States operated over 500 POW camps and branch facilities. Major camps rose in Texas, Oklahoma, Arizona, Nebraska, Iowa, and the Carolinas. Smaller branch camps spread into rural areas where labor was needed. The system was deliberate. Prisoners were placed near farms during harvest seasons, near timber operations, near supply depots that required unloading, sorting, and maintenance. The work was supervised, recorded, and compensated with canteen credit, exactly as regulations specified. For many prisoners, the first sustained exposure to American abundance occurred not in factories, but in food. Rations were calculated to meet or exceed the caloric intake of American soldiers in the field. Bread was white and plentiful. Meat appeared regularly. Coffee was not a substitute or ration luxury, but a daily fixture. Red Cross inspections confirmed compliance. Complaints, when they arose, were logistical, not existential. This was not accidental. The same supply chains that fed divisions overseas fed the camps at home. Warehouses did not distinguish between uniform color when issuing staples. Crates moved from rail to depot to mess hall with the same indifferent efficiency. To Axis prisoners accustomed to scarcity framed as moral strength, this abundance felt excessive, even unsettling. Beyond the camps, exposure deepened. Work details sent prisoners into the American interior. They labored beside civilians whose sons were fighting overseas, yet who offered no hostility. They handled produce that exceeded local consumption. They stacked grain silos already full. They repaired rail lines carrying goods far beyond immediate need. In some regions, prisoners worked near factories or depots where finished equipment waited in reserve. Trucks lined in rows, artillery wrapped against weather, ammunition sealed and stored rather than rushed. American guards, often older men, or those unfit for overseas duty, enforced rules without cruelty. Discipline existed, but it was procedural. The enemy was managed, not punished. This distinction mattered. It suggested confidence rather than fear. A system that could afford to be orderly under pressure revealed its strength without spectacle. Letters home, though censored, reflected this shift in perception. German POWs wrote of food and work, of routine and calm. Japanese prisoners, fewer in number and culturally isolated, observed silently, often with greater internal conflict. Across camps, a pattern emerged. Disbelief gave way to attention. Attention how much existed, how smoothly it moved, and how little of it seemed strained by the war itself. By the time prisoners were marched past supply depots or tasked with unloading crates marked for overseas shipment, the contrast could no longer be ignored. These were not reserves scraped together in desperation. They were layers, redundant, systematic, patient. And as prisoners labored within this machinery, the realization began to settle that the war they were fighting was not being decided only at the front. It was being decided here, quietly, by a country that did not appear to be running out of anything. The first angle through which this reality revealed itself was human, and it emerged slowly, through routine rather than revelation. Axis soldiers arrived in American camps, carrying the habits of deprivation. They ate quickly. They hoarded bread. They watched mess lines for signs of reduction. In the early weeks, many assumed the portions would shrink, that the abundance was temporary, a calculated display. But days passed, then months, and nothing changed. Meals remained consistent. Supplies did not thin. Hunger, once a constant companion, receded into memory. For men conditioned to equate endurance with virtue, This steadiness was disorienting. It removed a familiar framework for understanding war. The second angle was logistical, and it confronted them everywhere. Prisoners watched trains arrive not as emergencies, but as schedules. Cars unloaded, departed, and were replaced with mechanical precision. Warehouses functioned as reservoirs rather than lifelines. There was no visible panic, no improvisation. In Germany and Japan, logistics had become a daily struggle by 1943. Here, logistics appeared to have already won the war before a single battle was fought. Abundance was not chaotic. It was organized. From the enemy perspective, this contradicted everything they had been taught. Axis doctrine emphasized efficiency born of scarcity. America, they were told, relied on waste and excess because it lacked discipline. Yet inside the American system, excess itself was disciplined. Surplus did not mean disorder. It meant margin. It meant resilience. Prisoners began to understand that American power did not rest on individual toughness, but on systems designed to absorb shock without breaking. The recurring symbol that bound these angles together was food, simple, unremarkable, and constant. Bread crates appeared in depots, camps, and trains. Coffee was brewed in quantities that seemed careless. Canned meat arrived in layers, not counted individually. This food was not ceremonial. It was ordinary, and that ordinariness carried weight. It suggested a nation that could normalize what others considered luxury. For German prisoners, this realization often produced quiet reflection rather than resentment. Diaries and post-war interviews recorded confusion, even embarrassment. The narrative of American fragility began to collapse under the pressure of daily observation. For Japanese prisoners, whose cultural framework placed immense weight on honor and self-denial, the experience was more isolating. Abundance felt morally foreign. Yet even here, the system's consistency forced acknowledgement. By late 1944, many prisoners no longer questioned whether the United States could sustain the war. They questioned how long any opponent could endure against it. This shift did not come from ideology or persuasion. It came from exposure, from seeing supply after supply arrive without interruption, from realizing that nothing they handled appeared to be the last of its kind. The human response to this was not admiration, but recalibration. Expectations adjusted, beliefs softened, and as prisoners continued to move within the American war machine, another layer of understanding waited to emerge, one that extended beyond food and logistics toward technology, morality, and the deeper implications of organized abundance. The next layer of understanding unfolded through technology, not as spectacle, but as background. Prisoners assigned near depots or industrial zones observed machines that rarely stopped. Assembly lines moved with measured speed, neither frantic nor slow. Equipment arrived standardized, parts interchangeable, maintenance predictable. In Axis factories, shortages forced improvisation. Here, uniformity itself was a weapon. American production favored repetition over brilliance, volume over perfection. To soldiers raised on a myth of technical superiority, this was unsettling. The machines did not impress because they were elegant. They impressed because they were everywhere. This technological angle fed directly into a moral one. American guards enforced discipline without humiliation. Punishment, when applied, followed procedure. Medical care was available, not selectively, but systematically. Red Cross inspections were routine and open. This was not kindness in the sentimental sense. It was institutional confidence. The system did not need cruelty to assert control. For prisoners expecting vengeance, the absence of it created cognitive strain. If hatred was not returned, its purpose weakened. The ideological angle emerged last, and most quietly. American abundance did not argue. It did not lecture. It simply existed. Prisoners encountered newspapers openly critical of their own government, elections conducted during wartime, and civilians who spoke freely without fear of reprisal. None of this was staged. It was incidental, and because it was incidental, it carried credibility. The war machine functioned without silencing dissent, without demanding ritual sacrifice. That combination, material strength paired with visible openness, challenged the Axis belief that democracy was inherently weak. Food remained the constant symbol tying these angles together. It appeared in factories where workers ate without ration cards, in trains carrying surplus overseas, in camps where prisoners received the same staples day after day. The food did not symbolize generosity. It symbolized predictability. A system that could promise tomorrow's meal, without hesitation, was a system built on confidence. By this stage, the prisoners' attention had shifted. They no longer searched for cracks. They studied patterns. They compared what they saw with what they had been taught, and the discrepancies multiplied. American power was not emotional. It did not depend on slogans. It was procedural, layered, and indifferent to individual belief. As 1944 moved toward its close, reports from the front grew darker for the Axis. Bombing intensified. Retreats accelerated. Inside American camps and depots, the prisoners sensed the approaching conclusion before it was officially acknowledged. The machinery around them did not slow. If anything, it expanded. And in that expansion lay the turning point, not marked by a single battle or surrender, but by a realization shared quietly among those who moved through the system. This was not a war that could be won by endurance alone. The imbalance was structural. The outcome increasingly felt inevitable. By early 1945, the realization hardened into something more precise. It was no longer a vague sense of disadvantage, but a measured understanding of scale. Prisoners working near rail hubs watched manifests scroll past with destinations across oceans. France, Italy, the Pacific Islands, each line item representing equipment already built, already packed, already moving. There was no scramble in these movements. No sign that losses at the front demanded desperate acceleration. Replacement flowed as routine. The decisive moment for many Axis prisoners came not through news of defeat, but through comparison. German non-commissioned officers, trained to calculate supply ratios, quietly estimated what they were seeing. A single American depot held more motor vehicles than some entire Axis armies had fielded at their peak. Ammunition was stored not by necessity, but by category and future requirement. Food stocks were rotated for freshness, not scarcity. The war machine appeared to be operating ahead of demand. Letters and diaries from this period reveal a subtle shift in language. Early entries spoke of waiting, of uncertainty, of captivity as interruption. Later entries spoke of inevitability. Prisoners described America not as brutal or decadent, but as vast. The word appeared repeatedly in different forms. Vast in land, vast in production, vast in patience. This was not the enemy they had trained to defeat quickly. Food, again, marked the internal turning point. Bread did not diminish as Allied armies advanced. Coffee did not disappear as shipping lanes stretched across continents. Meat did not vanish when winter arrived. Each uninterrupted meal contradicted the logic of total war as the prisoners had understood it. In Germany and Japan, war meant tightening. Here, it meant expansion. American officers conducting routine briefings noticed the change. Prisoners asked fewer questions about release and more about production schedules. They watched equipment leave not with hope of disruption, but with a quiet recognition that what departed would be replaced before absence could be felt. Intelligence reports later noted that by late 1944, many German POWs openly acknowledged that the United States could outproduce any conceivable loss. This acknowledgement did not come with surrender ceremonies or declarations. It arrived internally, during work details and meal times, while unloading crates identical to those unloaded the week before. The symbolism was unmistakable. Nothing here was unique. Nothing here was fragile. Every object seemed designed to be replaced without sentiment. As the front lines in Europe collapsed and news filtered through camp radios, the prisoners already understood what the headline confirmed. Defeat was not approaching. It had been mathematically assured long before the final battles were fought. The war had been decided in places like this, among warehouses and rail yards, long before the last orders were given. The second phase of the turning point was quieter, but deeper. Once inevitability settled in, resistance lost its meaning. For Axis prisoners, the war ceased to be a contest of will and became a lesson in structure. They no longer measured American strength by headlines or battlefield reports, but by continuity. Nothing around them suggested exhaustion. Shifts rotated. Trains arrived. Warehouses refilled. The machine neither accelerated nor slowed in response to victory or loss. It simply continued. This constancy eroded the final pillar of Axis ideology, the belief that hardship itself conferred moral superiority. In camps and work details, prisoners compared memories of shortages at home with the stability before them. They remembered ration cards that grew smaller, equipment that could not be replaced, factories bombed into silence. Here, even the idea of silence felt foreign. There was always the sound of movement, engines idling, freight cars coupling, machinery humming. The sound did not demand attention. It existed as background, a reminder that the system was alive and unbroken. Food retained its role as the most immediate symbol of this transformation. Meals became markers of time rather than relief. Prisoners no longer rushed. Bread was eaten slowly. Coffee sipped without fear that it might be the last. The psychological shift was profound. When hunger disappears, space opens for thought. And in that space, beliefs once reinforced by deprivation began to dissolve. Some prisoners articulated this shift after the war. German veterans recalled that captivity in the United States forced them to confront a contradiction, a democratic society that fought total war without becoming totalitarian. The war machine, they observed, did not rely on fear to function. It relied on planning. This realization lingered long after repatriation, shaping post-war attitudes toward authority, governance, and economic organization. For Japanese prisoners, whose experience of capture carried unique cultural weight, the impact was more internalized. Few left extensive written records. Yet American intelligence summaries noted changes in behavior, greater cooperation, reduced hostility, increased curiosity. Even without overt acknowledgement, the lesson was absorbed. Material strength combined with procedural fairness created a form of power that was difficult to oppose. As Allied forces advanced and victory became official, the camps did not erupt in celebration. There was no dramatic release. The system continued to operate until the final administrative steps were complete. Prisoners were processed, documented, and prepared for return. The same machinery that had sustained war now managed its conclusion. In this, the ultimate symbolism emerged. The American war machine did not exist solely to destroy. It existed to organize, to feed, to move, to absorb enemies and return them change, not by coercion, but by exposure. And as the last crates were unloaded and reloaded for peacetime storage, the meaning of what the prisoners had witnessed became unavoidable. The war had not only been fought on beaches and battlefields, it had been fought and decided inside systems that never appeared to be under threat. When the fighting ended, the machinery did not vanish. It recalibrated. For the Axis prisoners still held in American camps in mid-1945, the end of the war arrived not as a dramatic rupture, but as a change in paperwork. Orders shifted from supply to demobilization. Crates once marked for Europe were reassigned. Trains still ran. Warehouses still opened each morning. The same system that fed armies now prepared to send men home. American military assessments conducted during this period recorded an unusual pattern. Interrogations of German prisoners no longer focused on tactics or loyalty. They focused on impressions. Many prisoners spoke candidly about what they had seen inside the United States, not with praise, but with clarity. Reports noted repeated references to production capacity, labor organization, and food availability. These were not emotional responses. They were analytical. One U.S. Army intelligence summary from late 1945 observed that a significant number of German POWs had concluded that the war was unwinnable for the Axis as early as 1943, not because of battlefield losses, but because of American industrial output. This conclusion had not come from bombing raids or propaganda leaflets. It had come from unloading trucks, counting crates, and watching schedules hold. Food again appeared in these records as a marker. Red Cross reports confirmed that American POW rations consistently met or exceeded international standards throughout the war. Post-war interviews revealed that for many prisoners, this fact alone dismantled long-held assumptions. Scarcity had been presented to them as universal. It was not. It had been situational. Repatriation exposed the contrast fully. Prisoners returned to cities reduced to rubble, to transportation networks and fragments, to ration systems still tightening even after surrender. The memory of American depots, quiet, full, untouched, stood in sharp relief. Some prisoners spoke later of the shock of returning to emptiness after years of seeing excess normalized. The psychological adjustment was as difficult as the physical one. Japanese prisoners, fewer in number and often returning to a devastated homeland, experienced a similar contrast amplified by cultural rupture. American intelligence reports noted that exposure to U.S. captivity had lasting effects on their views of governance and economy, though these effects were rarely articulated openly. The lesson was absorbed without being named. In both cases, the aftermath did not produce admiration so much as recalibration. The American war machine had demonstrated that modern war was no longer decided solely by courage or sacrifice. It was decided by systems capable of sustaining effort without collapse. That understanding lingered, quietly shaping the post-war world. The second phase of the aftermath was subtler, yet more profound, as prisoners reflected on the long-term implications of their experiences. Once home, they carried memories of abundance that contrasted sharply with the devastation they had left behind. In Germany, cities were in ruins, transportation was fragmented, and food was scarce. Repatriated soldiers noted the dissonance between what they had seen in America and what remained in their own country. Factories at once hummed now lay idle or destroyed. Grain silos were empty, rail lines twisted and broken. The contrast was unmistakable, and it forced a reconsideration of assumptions that had guided both strategy and ideology during the war. Memoirs and post-war interviews reveal that this confrontation with abundance had lasting effects. German veterans frequently mentioned the scale and efficiency of American logistics as unparalleled. Some described as incomprehensible or beyond belief, phrases repeated in intelligence summaries compiled for U.S. and Allied planners. Japanese veterans, though less vocal, exhibited similar acknowledgement in behavior and correspondence, indicating an internal reckoning with a system far more resilient than their own. The ideological consequences were even more striking. Soldiers indoctrinated to believe in the moral and technical superiority of their own nation began to question the narratives they had been fed. If abundance could coexist with discipline, organization, and fairness, then scarcity and harsh punishment were not inevitable features of effective governance. They were choices. For many, the revelation was disorienting. For some, it became instructive. Those who survived the war and lived to write or speak of it carried lessons about the intersection of system, society, and power. Reports also documented practical outcomes. Many POWs returned with insights into industrial processes, logistics management, and agricultural production that would influence post-war reconstruction. Engineers, technicians, and laborers who had observed American supply chains brought knowledge that accelerated rebuilding efforts in Europe and Asia. In this way, captivity and observation had extended influence beyond the individual, shaping the economic and organizational recovery of entire nations. Even as they resumed civilian life, the prisoners carried symbols of the war with them. The food crates, once ordinary and abundant, became emblematic in memory. They were not symbols of generosity, but a systemic capacity. The quiet, relentless ability to sustain millions without strain. The psychological imprint of that realization shaped attitudes toward planning, governance, and societal resilience. The war, in retrospect, had been won not only on beaches and battlefields, but in warehouses, depots, and factories, where the consistent hum of machinery and the regularity of meals spoke louder than any artillery shell. The enduring lesson, recorded in reports, diaries, and oral histories, was this: a society capable of organizing abundance in the midst of total war had power not merely because of its armies, but because its systems themselves were an instrument of strength, and the prisoners, once trained to oppose it, had observed it directly, unarmed and unresisting. The crates remained long after the last soldier had departed. Bread, coffee, and canned meat, ordinary objects, had silently narrated a story of power that no gunfire could convey. For the Axis prisoners who had handled them, these simple supplies became more than sustenance. They were a measure of society's capacity, a quiet proof that abundance itself could be weaponized not through force, but through structure. In the months and years that followed, veterans recalled not only the comfort of the meals, but the rhythm behind them. The trains that never halted, the warehouses that never emptied, the lines of trucks that rolled in precise order. It was a lesson in resilience, a demonstration that strength need not scream to exist. The hum of machinery, the smell of baking bread, the weight of stacked crates. They endured in memory as symbols of philosophy that contrasted sharply with the chaos they had been trained to expect. This encounter reshaped perception in subtle but lasting ways. Scarcity had been taught as a sign of discipline, deprivation as virtue. But here was a system where abundance was organized, predictable, and impartial. The prisoners had observed a society in which freedom and responsibility were entwined. Citizens could speak, vote, and work, and yet the machinery of war continued unbroken. The juxtaposition of liberty with efficiency was a revelation, one that challenged the very ideology that had sent them into battle. Ultimately, the experience illuminated a larger truth. Power is not only measured by conquest, but by the ability to sustain life, to feed people, and to organize without collapse. Democracy, in its practical, procedural form, proved capable of creating abundance on a scale that hardened belief and shattered preconceptions. The hum of factories and the ordinary presence of bread became emblems of a world that could endure, not because it crushed opposition, but because it nurtured its own. As the sun set over empty depots and silent rail yards, the lesson remained. True strength is both invisible and undeniable. And for those who had come as enemies, the evidence of that strength was in the simple, enduring fact that plenty persisted, even amid the chaos of war. January 1944, northern Texas. Dawn settles low over a flat stretch of land where the wind carries dust instead of gunfire. A freight train exhales steam along a siding bordered by barbed wire and wooden watchtowers. The cars are open one by one. Inside them, not weapons or wounded men, but crates, stacked with mathematical precision. Stenciled letters mark their contents in black ink. Flour, coffee, canned meat, sugar, enough to feed thousands. German soldiers step down onto the gravel, boots stiff from weeks of transport. They expect shouting. They expect hunger. They expect punishment. Instead, they smell bread, fresh, unmistakable, carried from a nearby mess hall where smoke rises calmly into the cold air. No urgency, no scarcity, just order. Beyond the wire, trucks move steadily along paved roads. Warehouses sit full, lights already on though the sun has barely risen. Nothing here feels temporary. Nothing feels strained. This is not a battlefield, yet it hums with power. For men raised on stories of American weakness and chaos, this quiet abundance lands heavier than any blow. And as they are marched past the crates, row after row disappearing into the distance, an unspoken realization begins to form, one that will follow them long after the war itself moves on.